The silence in a courtroom can be deafening. For Annabelle Pierce, it was a shroud. Dressed in simple black, she looked every bit the grieving widow the world expected her to be, broken, lost, and on the verge of losing everything. Across the room, the mistress, Genevieve Dubois, wept delicate tears into a silk handkerchief, her performance so convincing it had swayed the entire court. The judge was ready to rule, to strip Annabelle of her home, her memories, and her husband's legacy based on a mountain of lies. They thought Annabelle's silence was weakness. They thought she was defeated. They were wrong. Her silence wasn't an absence of words. It was the calm before a storm she was about to unleash with the press of a single button. The air in courtroom 4B of the San Mateo County Superior Court was thick with a cloying mixture of old wood polish, stale coffee, and manufactured sympathy. It was a sterile, unforgiving space, and for Annabelle Pierce, it felt like the final chamber of a life that was being methodically dismantled. 48 years old, with threads of silver just beginning to trace through her dark auburn hair, she sat with a posture so rigid it seemed a strong gust of wind might shatter her. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on a small, imperceptible scratch on the surface of the defense table. For the past 3 hours, she had listened to a narrative that painted her 22-year marriage to Robert Pierce as a hollow sham, a business arrangement that had long since expired. The architect of this fiction was Genevieve Dubois, a woman half her age with doe eyes that now brimmed with expertly timed tears. Flanked by her shark-toothed lawyer, Desmond Shaw, Genevieve looked less like a mistress and more like a tragic heroine from a bygone era. She wore a Chanel suit the color of cream and a single strand of pearls Annabelle recognized. Robert had given them to her on their 15th anniversary. The sight of them around Genevieve's slender neck was a physical blow, stealing the air from Annabelle's lungs. "Mrs. Dubois," Shaw began, his voice a low, resonant purr designed to soothe and persuade, "please tell the court about your relationship with the late Mr. Pierce." Genevieve dabbed at her eyes. "He wasn't Mr. Pierce to me," she whispered, her voice cracking beautifully. "He was Rob, my fiancé." A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Annabelle's own lawyer, Daniel Fletcher, a kind but increasingly stressed man in his late 50s, shifted in his seat. He'd warned her this would be difficult. He hadn't warned her it would be a public execution of her memory. Shaw guided Genevieve through her story with the precision of a master puppeteer. She spoke of a whirlwind romance, of a man trapped in a cold, loveless marriage. She described secret dinners, whispered promises of a future together, and the emotional prison Robert claimed to live in with Annabelle. "He told me he and her," Genevieve said, gesturing vaguely toward Annabelle without making eye contact, "hadn't been husband and wife for a decade. They were roommates. He stayed for the sake of appearances, for his company's image. But his heart was with me." Shaw then produced his first piece of evidence, a series of printed text messages. They were flowery, romantic, and utterly convincing. "I count the seconds until I can leave this empty house and be with you, my love," one of Robert's alleged texts read. "You are my future, Genevieve, the real Mrs. Pierce." Annabelle stared at the printouts. She knew Robert's texting style. He was abrupt, used abbreviations, and never once in 22 years had he used a term like "my love" in a text. These were forgeries, but they were good ones. Next came the ring. Shaw presented a velvet box containing a stunning 3-carat diamond ring. "Mr. Pierce proposed to my client 1 week before his tragic accident," he declared. "He wanted to spend the rest of his life with the woman he truly loved." Genevieve sobbed on cue, a heart-wrenching sound that echoed in the courtroom's solemn chambers. The final, most devastating blow was the will. Dated just 2 days before Robert's death, it was a complete reversal of his previous testament. In this new version, his entire $50 million estate, the real estate development company, the stock portfolio, their sprawling Atherton home, was left to his beloved fiancée, Genevieve Dubois. Annabelle was mentioned only once, in a cold, dismissive clause leaving her a token sum of $50,000 and a request to vacate the premises within 30 days. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like Robert's. It's a forgery, Fletcher had argued earlier, his voice strained. We have the original will, signed 15 years ago, leaving everything to his wife, Mrs. Pierce. But Shaw had been prepared. He'd brought in a handwriting expert, a slick professional named Dr. Alpert, who testified that the signature was, in his expert opinion, highly consistent with Mr. Pierce's known exemplars. He dismissed the slight variations as common in a signature made under emotional circumstances. Throughout it all, Annabelle remained silent. Her silence was a source of profound frustration for Daniel Fletcher. Annabelle, you have to fight back, he'd pleaded during a recess. Tell them about your marriage. Tell them about the life you built. Your silence is making you look guilty, like you have something to hide. But Annabelle had just shaken her head, her eyes distant. Not yet, Daniel, she'd whispered. Let them build their house of cards. Now the house stood tall and glittering, and the judge, a formidable woman named Marion Hawthorne, with a reputation for sharp intellect and little patience for theatrics, looked convinced. Her gaze softened when she looked at the weeping Genevieve, but turned to granite when it fell upon Annabelle. The silent, stoic widow fit the narrative Shaw had woven. Cold, distant, undeserving. Mr. Shaw, is that the conclusion of your presentation? Judge Hawthorne asked, her voice crisp. It is, Your Honor, Shaw said with a triumphant smile. The evidence is overwhelming. Robert Pierce's final wish was to provide for the woman he was going to marry, Ms. Dubois. Mr. Fletcher, the judge said, turning to their table, does your client have anything to say in response to these serious claims and this last will and testament? So far, she has said nothing. The court's patience is not infinite. Daniel Fletcher sighed a deep, weary sound. He placed a hand on Annabelle's arm. Annabelle, now is the time. Annabelle Pierce finally moved. She didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. She simply lifted her head, and for the first time that day, looked directly at Judge Hawthorne. Her eyes, which had been dull with what looked like grief, were now sharp and clear, like chips of ice. The courtroom quieted, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. I do, Your Honor, Annabelle said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremor everyone expected. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 2 decades as an ER nurse before joining her husband's company, a voice accustomed to chaos and command. I don't have documents filled with lies. I don't have forged letters or a ring bought for a fantasy. She reached into her simple leather handbag and pulled out a small black object. It was a solid-state hard drive. She placed it gently on the table in front of her. What I have, she said, her voice resonating with a quiet power that seized the attention of every person in the room, is a video. Desmond Shaw shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, this is procedural absurdity. We have no knowledge of this so-called evidence. It's inadmissible. Judge Hawthorne held up a hand. Her eyes narrowed, focused solely on the silent woman who had finally spoken. She ignored Shaw. A video of what, Mrs. Pierce? Annabelle's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second toward Genevieve, whose tear-streaked face had frozen in a mask of confusion and dawning apprehension. Of the truth, Annabelle replied. Desmond Shaw's objection was a roar in the otherwise silent courtroom. Your Honor, this is a desperate last-ditch stunt. The defense has had months to prepare. To spring video evidence at the 11th hour is a gross violation of discovery rules. It's undoubtedly doctored, irrelevant, and designed purely to harass my grieving client. Judge Hawthorne leveled a cool gaze at him. Mr. Shaw, your client's grief has been well documented this morning. Please allow me to ascertain the nature of this evidence before you dismiss it. Sit down. Shaw sat, his face a thundercloud. He leaned over and whispered furiously to Genevieve, whose perfectly poised mask was beginning to show fine cracks. Daniel Fletcher, on the other hand, looked as surprised as anyone. Annabelle had only told him to trust her, that she would provide what was needed when the time was right. He had assumed it would be a document, a witness, perhaps a discrepancy in the timeline he had missed. Not this. He rose cautiously. Your Honor, Fletcher said, finding his footing, while the existence of this specific format was unknown to me until this moment, my client, Mrs. Pierce, assures me it is directly relevant to the claims made today, specifically regarding the nature of Mr. Pierce's relationship with Miss Dubois and the validity of the purported will. The judge tapped her pen on her desk, her eyes boring into Annabelle. "Mrs. Pierce, this is my courtroom, not a theater. What is on this drive, and how did you obtain it?" Annabelle's story didn't begin on the day of Robert's death, or even in the months leading up to it. It began over a year ago, with a subtle but distinct shift in the tectonic plates of her marriage. Robert, a man whose ambition was matched only by his charisma, had always been a hard worker. Late nights at the office and business trips were the norm in their life. But this was different. It started with a scent of perfume that wasn't hers, a faint floral note clinging to his suit jacket. When she'd asked about it, he'd laughed it off. "Must have been from Carol in accounting. She practically bathes in the stuff. We were celebrating the Westfield contract." It was plausible. He was always plausible. Then came the phone calls. He started taking them in the garden or stepping out of restaurants. His phone, which had always lain face up on the nightstand, was now permanently face down. He'd added a new complex passcode she didn't know. These were the classic cliché signs of an affair, and Annabelle, a woman of deep pragmatism and quiet observation, recognized them immediately. But she didn't confront him. A confrontation would only lead to more lies, more gaslighting. Robert was a master builder, not just of luxury condos, but of narratives that suited his needs. Her suspicion wasn't born of jealousy alone, but of a deep, instinctual wrongness. It felt less like a midlife crisis and more like a hostile takeover. He wasn't just distant, he was secretive in a way that felt strategic. Financial statements that were once left on his desk were now locked away. He'd incorporated a new subsidiary for a project in Arizona, one he was curiously vague about. Annabelle Pierce had not been a passive wife. After leaving her high-pressure nursing career to raise their son, who was now grown and living in another state, she had become an integral part of Pierce development. She handled the books, managed the office, and knew the business inside and out. It was this knowledge that allowed her to see the financial anomalies that began to appear. Small but significant sums were being moved into the new subsidiary account, classified under vague labels like consulting fees and market research. The consulting company, Dubois Creative Solutions, was registered to a Genevieve Dubois. A quick, discreet search revealed she was a former promotions model and brand ambassador with no discernible experience in real estate or market research. Her social media profiles, however, showcased a sudden and dramatic upgrade in her lifestyle. Designer bags, luxury vacations to places that coincidentally matched Robert's business trips, and a new apartment in a trendy part of the city. The pain of this discovery was sharp and profound. It was a betrayal not just of their vows, but of their partnership. They had built their empire from a single, scrappy duplex renovation into a towering success. That she was being replaced by this cliché, and that Robert was using their shared wealth to fund it, hardened something within her. Her grief began then, a slow-burning ember of sorrow and anger. She knew she couldn't rely on emotional appeals. She needed facts, cold, hard, undeniable proof. She remembered a conversation with her nephew, Leo, a tech wizard who worked in cybersecurity. He was always talking about home security systems, smart devices, and the vulnerabilities of a connected world. On the pretense of wanting to upgrade their home security after a neighborhood break-in, she invited him over. "I want something discreet, Aunt Anna," he'd said. "Not those big, ugly domes. You want something that sees everything but isn't seen." "Exactly," Annabelle had replied, her heart pounding. Leo had installed a state-of-the-art system. It included several tiny, high-definition cameras, no bigger than a shirt button. One was disguised as a book on the shelf in Robert's home office. Another was a USB charger plugged into the wall in their living room. A third was a small magnetic device she could place in Robert's car. They were all linked to a secure, encrypted cloud server accessible only by her. At the time, she thought she was merely gathering evidence for a divorce attorney. She wanted to protect herself, to ensure that the life she had helped build wasn't simply handed to a younger, prettier replacement. She never imagined she would be gathering evidence for a probate hearing that bordered on a homicide investigation. Back in the courtroom, Annabelle answered the judge's question. "The contents of this drive were recorded in my own home, and my own vehicle over the past year, Your Honor, she said calmly. I had them installed as part of a security upgrade. I believe the footage will clarify Mr. Pierce's true feelings and intentions before his death. The judge's expression was unreadable. You're telling me you placed your husband under surveillance? I'm telling you, Annabelle corrected gently, that I protected my home. The recordings will speak for themselves. Judge Hawthorne considered this for a long moment. The legality was borderline, but recordings made by a spouse within the marital home often held up. And the possibility of perjury, of a massive fraud being perpetrated on her court, was a powerful motivator. Very well, the judge declared, her voice ringing with authority. The court will take a 30-minute recess. In that time, the bailiff will arrange for a monitor and speakers. Mr. Fletcher, Mr. Shaw, you will join me in my chambers to review this video in private first. If I deem it relevant and admissible, we will play it for the court. She banged her gavel, the sound cracking like a gunshot. As the judge swept from the room, Annabelle's eyes met Genevieve's across the aisle. The younger woman's face was no longer a picture of sorrow. It was pale, tight, and for the first time filled with pure, undiluted fear. The judge's chambers were an oasis of calm compared to the tense courtroom. Books lined the walls and a large oak desk dominated the space. Judge Hawthorne sat behind it, flanked by Fletcher and a simmering Desmond Shaw. A large monitor had been set up on a side table. The bailiff, a burly man named Peterson, inserted the drive Annabelle had provided into a laptop and connected it to the screen. Let's see what you have, Mrs. Pierce, the judge said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Annabelle, who had been asked to join them, simply nodded and used the mouse to click on the first video file. The screen flickered to life. The image was crisp and clear, showing a wide shot of Robert Pierce's luxurious home office. Bookshelves, architectural awards, a sprawling desk. Robert himself was in the frame, sitting behind the desk, talking on his phone via speaker. He was laughing. The date and timestamp in the corner read 6 months prior. No, Walter, you're not getting it, Robert said, chuckling. He was talking to Walter Schmidt, his longtime business partner. She's not a long-term plan. She's a distraction. A very, very expensive distraction. I'll grant you that. In the small chamber, Desmond Shaw stiffened. Genevieve, who was not present, had painted a picture of an epic love story. This was not that. On screen, Robert leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of scotch. She's got these grand ideas. Thinks she's going to be the next Mrs. Pierce. She's even talking about redecorating the house. He let out a short, derisive laugh. Honestly, her taste is atrocious. All white and gold. Like a dictator's palace. Daniel Fletcher shot a quick glance at Annabelle. Her face was a marble mask, betraying nothing, but he could imagine the sting of hearing this casual cruelty, this confirmation of her husband's double life. She's a little gullible, Robert continued into the phone, and she believes everything I tell her. It's flattering in a way. But leave Annabelle. Are you insane? Annabelle runs the books. Annabelle knows where all the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. This company, this life, it's as much hers as it is mine. I'd be a fool to walk away from that. This thing with Genevieve is just fun. It'll run its course. Judge Hawthorne watched the screen, her expression unreadable, but her focus absolute. Shaw, however, was already formulating his counterattack. Stop the video, Shaw demanded. The bailiff paused it. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. It was recorded 6 months ago. Feelings change. People deepen their commitments. This proves nothing about Robert's state of mind in the week before his death. I disagree, Mr. Shaw, the judge said coolly. It directly contradicts your client's sworn testimony that her relationship with Mr. Pierce was, from the start, a committed partnership destined for marriage. It speaks to a pattern of deception. Please continue the video. Annabelle clicked on the next file. This one was audio only, the view a static image of a car's dashboard. The audio quality was excellent. It was Robert's voice again, but this time he wasn't alone. Genevieve was in the car with him. The date stamp was from 3 months before Robert died. I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this, Rob. Genevieve's voice whined, sounding sharp and petulant. a stark contrast to the soft, grieving woman in the courtroom. Difficult? I moved $100,000 into the consulting account last week, Jen. What more do you want? Robert sounded irritated. It's not about the money, it's about the principle. It's about our future, she insisted. You said you were going to start putting things in my name. For security. You promised you'd talk to your lawyer about the will. There was a pause. The sound of a turn signal clicked rhythmically. I said I'd think about it, Robert said, his voice flat. Changing a will like mine isn't like changing your dinner plans. It's complicated. It involves Annabelle. We are not at that stage yet. Not at that stage? Genevieve's voice rose, becoming shrill. We've been together for over a year. You told me you loved me. You told me she meant nothing to you. Was that all a lie? Lower your voice, Robert snapped. Of course it wasn't a lie, but you need to be patient. Pushing like this, it's unattractive. The word unattractive hung in the air of the judge's chambers, thick with malice. This was not a conversation between two people deeply in love. It was a transaction, and one of the parties was getting impatient. Judge Hawthorne gestured for the video to be stopped. She looked at Shaw. Mr. Shaw, your client testified under oath that Mr. Pierce was eager to change his will for her. This recording suggests he was, at best, reluctant and was being pressured. Do you have an explanation for this discrepancy? Shaw, for the first time, seemed to fluster. As I said, Your Honor, relationships evolve. This was clearly a snapshot, a momentary disagreement that they obviously resolved, as evidenced by the final will he signed. It was a weak defense, and everyone in the room knew it. The foundation of Genevieve's story, the great love that had prompted Robert to disinherit his wife of 2 decades, was crumbling. What was emerging in its place was a portrait of a manipulative woman pressuring a wealthy man who saw her as little more than a temporary amusement. The judge turned back to Annabelle. Is there more, Mrs. Pierce? There is, Your Honor, Annabelle said, her voice steady. The recordings get closer to the date of my husband's death. They show that the pressure from Ms. Dubois didn't just continue, it escalated into threats. She moved the mouse to a folder labeled The Final Month. The look on Desmond Shaw's face was no longer one of confidence. It was the look of a man watching his meticulously constructed case catch fire. He had built his entire argument on the strength of Genevieve's tearful performance in a single, dubious document. He had never anticipated that the silent widow at the defense table had a library of the truth, recorded and cataloged, waiting to be played. The house of cards was beginning to sway. When the small group reconvened in the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. The brief recess, Judge Hawthorne's stony expression, and the grim set of Desmond Shaw's jaw had sent a wave of anticipation through the gallery. Something had happened in those chambers. The narrative was shifting. Genevieve Dubois looked over at her lawyer, her eyes wide with frantic questions, but he refused to meet her gaze. He was busy shuffling papers, his movements jerky and agitated. The performance was over. The fear was real. The court is back in session, Judge Hawthorne announced, her voice resonating with a new, sharper edge. Having reviewed the initial evidence provided by Mrs. Pierce in chambers, I have deemed it highly relevant and admissible. We will now proceed. She nodded to the bailiff, who pressed a button. The large monitor, now facing the entire courtroom, came to life. Annabelle directed him to the third file. The scene was the home office again. The date stamp showed it was from 5 weeks before Robert's death. Robert was on the phone, but this time his tone wasn't amused. It was tense, angry. I told you, Walter, she's becoming a problem, Robert said, pacing behind his desk. She's not just asking for money anymore. She's talking about our assets. She somehow got the name of my estate lawyer, Bill Peterson, and called his office trying to schedule an appointment on my behalf. A gasp went through the courtroom. Yeah, Bill called me immediately, Robert continued, rubbing his temples. Said she was asking hypothetical questions about how a man could amend his will to protect a new partner from a vindictive ex-wife. Can you believe the audacity? He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. I shut it down, of course. Told Bill under no circumstances was he to speak with her or make any changes to my estate plan. I reiterated that everything, and I mean everything, remains with Annabelle. This was a direct hit. It proved Robert had explicitly instructed his longtime lawyer not to change the will, torpedoing the possibility that he had later gone to a different lawyer to draft the one Shaw had presented. Daniel Fletcher rose to his feet. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I would like to recall Mr. Shaw's handwriting expert, Dr. Alpert. Judge Hawthorne nodded. Dr. Alpert, please retake the stand. The expert, looking considerably less confident, returned to the witness box. Fletcher approached him. Dr. Alpert, you testified earlier that the signature on the will presented by Ms. Dubois was highly consistent with Mr. Pierce's. Given what we've just heard, that Mr. Pierce had no intention of changing his will, does that not raise a significant red flag for you? My job is to analyze the pen strokes, the pressure, the form, not the author's intent, Dr. Alpert said defensively. Of course, Fletcher agreed smoothly, but a masterful forgery would seek to replicate those things exactly, wouldn't it? Tell me, Doctor, in your expert analysis, did you submit the ink from the signature to spectrographic analysis to determine its age? Well, no, Alpert stammered. That wasn't requested. I was only asked to compare the form of the signature. So it's possible, Fletcher pressed, that the signature is a trace, or that it was signed with a specific type of ink that could be proven to be different from the ink Mr. Pierce customarily used? For example, the ink from the pen he kept on his desk for 20 years, the one he signed every major contract with. It's hypothetically possible, Alpert conceded, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. Thank you, Doctor. No further questions. Fletcher sat down. He had just shown the court that Shaw's expert had done a superficial analysis of a document whose very existence was now profoundly suspicious. The will, Genevieve's golden ticket, was looking more and more like a fake. Annabelle then directed the bailiff to the final clip from that folder. The date was now just 2 weeks before Robert died. The audio was from his car again. This time Genevieve was screaming. After everything I've done for you, after everything I've given up, her voice shrieked, distorted by rage. You've given up nothing. Robert's voice boomed back, equally furious. You've been living like a queen on my dime. I've paid for your apartment, your car, your entire life for the last 18 months. You haven't given up anything. I gave you the best years of my life. You're 26, Robert roared. Don't be so melodramatic. This arrangement is over, Genevieve. It's done. I'm telling you this for the last time. Stop calling my lawyer. Stop harassing my business partner. And stay away from my house. There was a moment of shocking silence. Then Genevieve's voice dropped to a low, chilling hiss. It was more terrifying than her screaming. You will regret this, Robert, she whispered. You have no idea what I'm capable of. People who have everything to lose should be very, very careful. You have a reputation, a company, a wife. It would be a shame if something happened to disrupt all of that. The recording ended. The courtroom was utterly still. The implication was unmistakable. It was a threat. Desmond Shaw jumped to his feet, his face pale. Objection! Your Honor, this is a lover's quarrel. My client was distraught, emotional. Her words are being twisted into something they are not. But the damage was done. The image of the soft, weeping victim had been irrevocably shattered. In her place was a demanding, manipulative woman who, when faced with the end of her luxurious lifestyle, had resorted to threats. Genevieve Dubois was no longer looking at Annabelle. Her eyes were locked on the monitor, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. The screen was no longer just showing images of the past. It was showing her lies, her rage, her true self. Judge Hawthorne looked down from her bench, her face a mask of grim fury. She had been played. The lies told in her courtroom were not just misleading. They were a calculated, malicious attempt to defraud an innocent woman and subvert the law. Mr. Shaw, the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet, I suggest you advise your client to remain silent. Mrs. Pierce, you indicated you had one final recording, one from the night your husband died. Annabelle Pierce took a deep, steadying breath. She had saved the worst for last. This wasn't just about exposing a fraud anymore. It was about revealing a crime. Yes, Your Honor, Annabelle said, her voice clear and strong. I do. The tension in courtroom 4B had become a living entity. It pressed down on everyone, thick and suffocating. The bailiff stood a little straighter. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys. Genevieve Dubois seemed to have shrunk in her expensive suit, her face ashen. Desmond Shaw had stopped objecting. He now stood beside his client, a hand on her shoulder, looking less like a lawyer and more like a man bracing for a car crash. "Bailiff, play the final file," Judge Hawthorne commanded. Annabelle's gaze was fixed on the screen, but her mind was back in that terrible night. Robert had been pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause was a tragic accident. The paramedics had told her it looked like he'd tripped at the top of the grand staircase in their foyer and fallen, striking his head on the marble floor. There was a gash on the back of his head. It all seemed plausible. He'd been drinking. He'd been stressed. Accidents happen. But Annabelle, with her nurse's training, had seen things that didn't add up. The position of his body was wrong for a simple fall. The amount of blood seemed inconsistent with the wound. And on the bar cart in the living room, near the top of the stairs, she had noticed that the heavy crystal Scotch decanter, his favorite, was slightly out of place. There was a tiny dark smudge near its base she hadn't been able to identify. The police, eager to close the case on a wealthy man's accidental death, had missed it. Or perhaps they hadn't looked. The day after the funeral, numb with a complex grief that mixed sorrow for the man she had loved with anger at his betrayal, she had forced herself to check the footage from the living room camera. She didn't know what she was looking for. An explanation, perhaps. Closure. What she found was a horror. The video that now played on the courtroom monitor was from the camera disguised as a USB charger. It offered a wide, clear view of their living room, with the top of the foyer staircase visible in the background. The timestamp confirmed it was the night of Robert's death, approximately 1 hour before the 911 call was placed. Robert was on screen, standing near the bar cart, pouring himself a drink. He looked tired and haggard. A moment later, the front door opened, and Genevieve entered. She hadn't used the doorbell. She had a key. "What the hell are you doing here, Genevieve?" Robert asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I told you it was over." "You can't just end this," she shot back, throwing her purse onto a chair. She was dressed for a night out, but her face was tight with fury. "You don't get to use me for 2 years and then just throw me away like trash." "It was a mistake," Robert said, turning to face her. "The whole thing. I was weak, and I was flattered, and I was a fool. I'm going to tell Annabelle everything. I'm going to try to save my marriage." Genevieve let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Save your marriage? To that museum piece? I am your life now, Robert. You promised me." "I promised you nothing," he said, his voice cold as ice. "I bought you things. There's a difference." He took a step toward her. "And it's worse than you think. I had my accountants do a deep dive on that consulting subsidiary I set up for you. Funny thing, about half the money I put in there wasn't spent on market research. It was transferred to an offshore account in your name. You weren't just my mistress, Genevieve. You were a thief." The courtroom let out a collective, horrified gasp. Genevieve was not just a homewrecker. She was an embezzler. On the screen, Genevieve's face went from rage to panic. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I do," Robert said, pulling out his phone. "I have the bank records. I should have gone to the police. But I'm going to do that right now. You're not just getting cut off. You're going to prison." He turned his back on her, his thumb hovering over his phone screen to make the call. It was the last mistake of his life. The camera's angle was perfect. It captured the exact moment Genevieve's eyes darted to the bar cart. It saw her expression twist from panic into a mask of pure reptilian fury. In one swift, fluid motion, she lunged toward the cart, her hands wrapping around the base of the heavy, crystal decanter. She took 3 quick steps toward Robert's unsuspecting back. She raised the decanter high above her head with both hands. The video showed her bringing it down with sickening force against the back of Robert's skull. The sound that filled the courtroom was not a Hollywood sound effect. It was a dull, wet, cracking thud that was horribly, viscerally real. Robert let out a single guttural groan, his body going rigid for a second before he crumpled, pitching forward. He didn't fall down the stairs. He fell to the floor of the living room, out of the camera's view. The video didn't stop. It recorded Genevieve standing over him, her chest heaving, the decanter still clutched in her hands. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and adrenaline. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the woman on the screen, the same woman who had wept for her lost fiancé, frantically wiped the decanter clean with the edge of her jacket, placed it back on the bar cart, and then grabbed Robert's limp body by the arms. The audio captured her grunts of exertion as she dragged his dead weight the few feet to the top of the staircase. There was a final, heavy shove, followed by a series of horrific, tumbling thuds as his body bounced down the marble steps. The video feed showed Genevieve, breathing heavily, peering down the stairs. Then she straightened her clothes, smoothed her hair, took a deep breath, and pulled out her own phone. The camera recorded her practicing her hysterical sobs, quietly at first, then louder, working herself into a frenzy. After a moment, she dialed 911. "Help!" her voice shrieked, the same practiced, hysterical voice the court had heard traces of all morning. "My fiancé! He fell! He fell down the stairs! Please, hurry! There's so much blood!" The video ended. The screen went black, but the horror remained, hanging in the air like a poisonous fog. For a full 10 seconds, the courtroom was plunged into a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum. No one moved. No one breathed. The black screen was a void that had swallowed every lie, every deception, and exposed the monstrous truth beneath. The silence was shattered by a single unearthly scream. "No! It's a lie! It's fake! She faked it! A deep fake! She edited it!" It was Genevieve. She was on her feet, her face contorted into a hideous mask of terror and rage, pointing a trembling finger at Annabelle. "That witch! She hated him! She did it, and she's framing me!" Desmond Shaw looked like he'd been turned to stone, his face a sickly gray color. His case, his career, had just evaporated in the face of a snuff film starring his own client. Judge Hawthorne's face was a study in controlled fury. She banged her gavel, the sound like a thunderclap in the charge room. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" Two bailiffs immediately moved toward Genevieve, who had started to claw at her own lawyer's arm, her shrieks becoming more unhinged. "Tell them, Desmond! Tell them it's not real! You have to help me!" "Ms. Dubois," the judge's voice cut through the chaos, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "You will be silent, or you will be held in contempt." She pointed her gavel at the bailiffs. "Restrain her." The bailiffs took Genevieve by the arms. Her fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, replaced by ragged, desperate sobs as she was forced back into her chair. Judge Hawthorne's gaze swept across the stunned courtroom before landing on Annabelle. The widow sat, as she had all day, poised and still, but there were now two silent tears tracing paths down her cheeks. They were not tears of weakness or of victory, but of profound, gut-wrenching sorrow for the final, ugly truth of her husband's end. "Mrs. Pierce," the judge said, her voice softer now, tinged with something that sounded like awe and apology. "You have been in possession of this evidence since your husband's death. Why did you not go to the police?" This was the question everyone was thinking. Annabelle finally rose to her feet, her movements graceful and deliberate. She addressed the judge, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. "Your Honor, when I first saw that video, my instinct was to run to the police," she began, her voice trembling slightly before steadying. "But I knew what would happen. Ms. Dubois would hire a lawyer like Mr. Shaw. They would claim it was self-defense. They would say Robert attacked her, and she fought back. They would drag his name and my name through the mud. They would dissect our marriage and use his affair to paint him as a villain who deserved what he got. They would try to create doubt." She took a breath, her eyes finding Genevieve's. "I knew her greatest weapon was her ability to lie, to perform. So I decided to let her perform on the biggest stage she could find, under oath, in a court of law. I wanted her to build her entire world of lies, the epic romance, the proposal, the forged will, so that when the truth came out, it wouldn't just create doubt. It would obliterate everything she said. It would leave no room for any other narrative." She turned her gaze back to the judge. "I didn't want justice to be a plea bargain for manslaughter. I wanted it to be a conviction for murder, built on her own greed and perjury. I needed her to hang herself with her own lies before I showed them the rope. It was a brilliant, cold, and devastatingly effective strategy. She had given Genevieve enough rope, and the woman had gleefully fashioned her own noose. Judge Hawthorne stared at Annabelle, a long, assessing look. She saw not a vengeful woman, but a deeply intelligent and wounded one who had navigated an impossible situation with terrifying clarity. "I see," the judge said finally. She turned to the court clerk. "This probate hearing is hereby suspended indefinitely. The document purported to be the last will and testament of Robert Pierce is impounded as evidence in a criminal investigation. A certified copy of the video evidence presented today, along with a full transcript of these proceedings, is to be delivered to the district attorney's office immediately." She then fixed her eyes on Genevieve Dubois. "Ms. Dubois, you are remanded into custody without bail, pending charges of murder, perjury, and fraud. Mr. Shaw, I hope for your sake you had no prior knowledge of any of this." Desmond Shaw could only shake his head, looking utterly defeated. As the bailiffs pulled a now limp Genevieve to her feet to lead her away, her eyes met Annabelle's one last time. There was no defiance in them, no hatred. There was only the blank, hollow look of utter ruin. She hadn't just lost a court case. She had lost her freedom, her future, her very self. She was no longer Genevieve Dubois, the glamorous fiancée. She was a killer, exposed for the entire world to see. And the silent widow was the one who had brought her down. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of media frenzy and legal procedure. The story of the silent widow's video was sensationalized on every news channel. Pundits debated Annabelle's strategy, some calling her a brilliant mastermind, others a cold, calculating vigilante. But Annabelle ignored it all. She retreated into the quiet sanctuary of her home, the home she had fought for, the home that was now a crime scene filled with ghosts. Genevieve Dubois was formally charged with first-degree murder, forgery, and a litany of fraud charges related to the embezzlement. With the video as irrefutable evidence, her new court-appointed defense attorney had little to work with. They tried to float a theory of self-defense, as Annabelle had predicted, but Genevieve's own performance in court and the cold, calculated nature of the murder's cover-up on the video made it an impossible sell. Walter Schmidt, Robert's business partner, testified about the embezzlement scheme, corroborating the motive. The estate lawyer, Bill Peterson, testified that Robert had explicitly told him he had no intention of changing his will. The house of cards had been so thoroughly demolished that not a single card remained. 6 months later, to avoid a trial she could not possibly win and the potential of a death penalty sentence, Genevieve Dubois accepted a plea deal. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her name, once whispered in gossip columns, was now a byword for greed and deadly deception. For Annabelle, the legal victory was not a moment of triumph. It was the closing of a painful, brutal chapter. Justice, she discovered, was not a celebration. It was a heavy, somber thing that left echoes in its wake. She spent her days sorting through 22 years of a shared life. She found old photo albums filled with smiling images of a younger Robert, the ambitious, charming man she had fallen in love with, long before wealth and secrets had eroded the foundation of their marriage. She found his old architectural sketches, reminders of the brilliant mind she had so admired. Her grief was complicated. She mourned the man he had been. She mourned the marriage they had lost. And she was furious at the betrayal that had nearly cost her everything. But as she packed away his clothes and cleared out his office, she found a sense of peace settling over her. She was not just Robert Pierce's widow. She was Annabelle Pierce, a survivor. One sunny afternoon, her best friend Brenda Walsh came over to find Annabelle in the garden, pruning her rose bushes. "How are you doing?" Brenda asked gently, handing her a glass of iced tea. "I'm all right," Annabelle said, snipping a withered bloom from a stem. "Some days are harder than others. I still find myself listening for the sound of his car in the driveway." She paused, looking at the vibrant, blooming roses around her. "But the silence in the house is different now. It's not the empty silence of loss anymore. It feels clean. It feels like my own." She had reclaimed her home, her finances, and her name. Pierce Development was now under her sole control, and with Walter Schmidt's help, she was restructuring it, ensuring its legacy, their legacy, would continue. She had navigated the darkest period of her life, not with hysterics or public battles, but with quiet intelligence, unyielding strength, and a deep-seated belief in the power of the unvarnished truth. The world had seen her as a silent victim, a woman on the verge of being erased. But her silence had never been weakness. It was a shield, a strategy, a crucible in which her resolve was forged. In the end, it was the lies that had been loud, flashy, and ultimately fragile. The truth, when it was finally revealed, had needed no embellishment. It had simply and devastatingly spoken for itself. The story of Annabelle Pierce is a powerful reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most observant. She endured unimaginable betrayal, not just from her husband, but from a system that was ready to believe a beautiful liar over a silent, grieving woman. But she turned her pain into a plan, using technology and strategy to ensure that the truth would have its day in court in the most dramatic way possible. Her story isn't just about winning a legal battle. It's about reclaiming one's life, dignity, and narrative from those who would try to steal it. If this story of resilience and ultimate justice moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who might need to hear a story of strength overcoming deception. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will captivate and inspire you. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.